We were looking at the data catalog, and within the data
Yeah.
catalog, we saw the dataset workspace. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
most important part, or the first part of a dataset workspace, is obviously the dataset pipeline, right? Because that is what
Yeah.
feeds into a dataset. Okay,
Correct.
so let's go into the system and create or look at a data set pipeline once again. Okay, so a data set consists of one or multiple pipelines,
Okay.
right? So a data set, it contains one or multiple pipeline. Where can I check the pipelines associated with a data set? I can do that by opening any
While
data set,
editing
right?
the data set. Yeah.
Right,
Opening any
right.
data set. Yeah.
Okay. So now what is a pipeline, right? A pipeline
Yeah.
is nothing but a container of data set stages. So a pipeline consists of one or multiple data set stages. So what is a stage? We'll talk about that next. Right? So a stage, basically what a stage does is, or what ultimately what a pipeline does it models the flow of data and determines how it will be transformed. So when a data enters a pipeline, it may have some X format, and by the time it outputs, it may have some Y format, right? So a pipeline
Okay.
is a container of data set stages that models basically the flow of data and define how it should be transformed, right? So each pipeline, it consists of a list of stages, and each stages, so ultimately a pipeline is a list of stages, and data when enters a pipeline, it enters a given stage within the pipeline, and when it exits that stage, it may be modified as part of that stage, and then that modified data can then be entered into another data stage and then modified there from where it would exit, and so on and so forth. So each stage within a pipeline is a modification of the data, right? And there are different stages and different kinds of modifications that can be applied. Okay, so
Okay.
a pipeline basically consists of an ordered list of stages, with each stage defining how to modify the data at that point in the pipeline. Give me
Mm-hmm.
a quick second. Sorry, I'm actually getting a pen. Sorry, someone had pinged me on my office laptop. Uh,
Okay.
okay. Now, as I mentioned, a data set may consist of one or multiple stages, right? So, and we know that there are
Mm-hmm.
two types of data sets. One is a base data set.
Mm-hmm.
So, a base data set, it contains only one pipeline. So, a base data set, it contains only one pipeline, while a derived data set, it may contain one or more pipelines. So a base data set cannot have more than one pipelines.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm also pinging side by side. Okay, now
Mm.
every data set, irrespective of whether it is a base data set or a derived data set, it will have at least one primary pipeline,
Okay.
right? So when, because in a base data set there is only one pipeline, that itself would be its primary pipeline. In derived data set there would be at least one primary pipeline. In addition to that, there can be multiple additional pipelines,
Okay.
right? So every data set will have a primary pipeline and only one primary pipeline. So data set cannot have more than one primary pipeline. Okay. Uh, Sorry, yeah. Give me a quick second, Sai.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Actually, there's a very important meeting today for me at 8 o'clock. We have to take a number of design decisions on compensation, and they've been pending for a very long time. So today, whole day, actually, I was busy with that.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay. Now, what is the first stage of a pipeline? So the first pipeline, or the first stage in a pipeline, it brings
It,
data
it,
from the data set source. So every data set ultimately Sai has a data source, right? So for example, if I talk about a base data set, right, which my data
yeah.
source would either be some external file from outside Workday, it could be some external file which I have picked from SFTP, it could be some custom report through which I'm bringing data from Workday. So a base data set would also have a data source, correct? And similarly, a
Yeah.
derived data set would also have a data source, right? When I say
Okay.
data source, this is from where data enters into that data set. So every pipeline will have a data source,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay, now the first stage of a pipeline is always the stage from which the data set brings in the data, right? So this stage, and I'll show you in the system in a bit. So stage listed after, so let me, okay. So let's assume I have created a base data set. So when I create a base data set, it would have a pipeline automatically created, right? In this pipeline, the first stage is the stage which imports data into this data set.
So that's for the derived data set, right?
Okay, how about a base data set? How will I create a base data set?
No, I remember for the based
Mhm.
data set we had. Maybe I'm getting confused. Okay. I
Okay,
I thought for
so
the based data set we okay.
let
Yeah,
me
yeah. For
show
the
you.
based data set we have import
Mhm.
and
Yes, yes. Import is also a stage, right? When you say import or
stage.
parts
Yeah,
and so on and so forth, these are all called
yeah.
stages, right?
Right.
So the first stage is obviously, see, even when I'm talking about a base data set, okay, let's say I have
Mm.
a base data set BD1. In this data set, I'm reading data, some external data from file, right? So obviously, this external data has to be read into or received into the base data set. And this is done by the first stage, right? Now, this base data set then goes into a derived data set, right? So from base data set, I'm moving data into derived data set. Now again, for this derived data set, this base data set becomes the source of data, right? So even this derived data set has to import the data from the base data set itself, right? So a data set
Okay.
simply moves data from one data set to another to another to another until we reach the published data set wherein the data is published. Okay, I'll show that.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, stages that are listed after the first stage in a pipeline, right? It take the output of the previous stage as the input to the current stage and transform it, right? So we can visualize this simply as a series. Let me do one thing. Let's delete this. So I have a series of buckets, right? Which I'm referring to as stage. Stage 1, and then I have bucket 2, and then I have bucket 3, right? These buckets are part
Yeah.
of a pipeline. So overall, all these three buckets are part of a pipeline, right? And pipeline plus many other pipelines will be part of a derived of a data set. So data set,
Okay.
right? So at the top, I have a data set, right? Within a data set, there may be one or multiple pipelines. Within a pipeline, there are a series of buckets, stages. So what are these buckets doing? Data is coming from outside the data set into that data set through the first bucket, which is the first stage. From here, it moves to the second bucket. So the output of first bucket is the input of second bucket. The output of second bucket is the input of third bucket, and so on and so forth. Make sense?
Okay.
I'll show this in the
Yeah.
10th.
So what we are saying is okay.
So
Okay.
let
Okay.
me
Okay.
show, right? So a data set consists of one or multiple pipelines. A pipeline again in turn consists of one or multiple stages. But the first stage
Yeah.
is always the stage which is getting data into that
Getting data.
right? Because it has to
Okay.
import data, right? From somewhere. Data
Okay.
cannot get
Yeah.
created
Yeah.
automatically, right? So it has to import
Correct.
data
Correct.
from somewhere. So that is what the first stage does. Oh, okay, when I actually show this in the system, it will make a lot more sense, right? And the last stage, so the first stage is always the stage which brings in data. Similarly, the last stage is always the stage which is the output of that entire pipeline or that entire data set, right? So the first stage
Okay.
imports data into the data set, and the last stage's output is the output of that data set. In between this first and last stage, there could be a number of
Mm-hmm.
transformations that you can do. You can do a
Okay.
join, you can do a union, you can merge, and so on and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Okay.
So the last stage of any pipeline, again, pipeline is part of a data set. Just to iterate, is the output of that pipeline. right? Then the
Mm-hmm.
output of the primary pipeline. So what if, so the last stage of any pipeline is the output of that pipeline. A data set may have multiple pipelines, right? So the output of the
Yeah.
primary pipeline is the output of the entire data set.
Okay.
Okay. So the output of the last stage is the output of the pipeline, and the output of the primary pipeline is the output of the entire data set. Just remember this
Yeah.
is the output of the entire data set, right? So if I go into the system once again, let's select some derived data set. Uh, let's take, I am just checking. So let's look at this data set. So I actually have two views on a data set, right? The first one is we have
Mm-hmm.
already seen I can view the data in a new tab, right? And this is the output. And I
Yeah.
would click on edit. But at the same time, I can do one thing. I can also view the lineage of that data. So let's look at the lineage of this data set. So this now, if you see, this is actually a derived data set,
Mm.
right?
Just the naming
So,
convention. Okay.
right, just the naming convention, but system automatically knows. So system considers any data set which
Oh,
is not created from a file, and that's why we have seen that based on the data set type, the stages that are available would differ, right?
right,
So on
right, right.
derived data sets you have many more options available with respect to creating stages. Okay, now this is what I wanted to tell you. So this is my first data set, right? This is my base
Mm.
data set, right? This is
Mm.
importing data from either within workday through a report, or it is importing data through a file or through an FTP server, anything, right? So the first stage of this data set is to read that data, right? To import that data. And then it and then we output that data from here, which is then consumed into this derived data set. So every data set, whether it is base data set or derived data set, it has to read data from somewhere else, right? So this data set is reading data which is output of this data set. Similarly, this data set is reading data which is output of this data set. This data set
Is
is
it
reading
like,
data. Mhm.
sorry, maybe, yeah, I got that. So is it like the way how Studio works because the sequential way of processing, wherein one component results will be outputted to a different
Mm,
component. So it's a
exactly.
similar
Right.
terminologies,
Right.
right? Okay.
Similar terminology,
Okay.
right?
Clear.
Okay, but
Yeah.
then this is the difference. If you see, this is also derived data set, this is also, so everything from here, these are all derived data sets. But while
Mm.
a base data set can only have one pipeline, a derived data set, if you see, it has two pipelines. One is coming from here, second one is coming from here, right? So if I open this data set, view in a new tab.
Is it
So
like
if
you
you
have
see,
done some joint? Joint.
right, those are all
Okay.
stages and we'll talk about them. Oh my God.
Okay. Okay. Sure.
So,
Please take it.
so if I open here uh, and click on edit, so this is the primary pipeline for this data set. What is it? Employee headcount, which is this one,
Mm.
right?
Mm. Mm.
And then, however, if I, and this pipeline, if you see, has two stages. One is always, now this is something we have already discussed, right? The first stage is always the
Yeah.
stage which gets data into that data set. The output of that stage would then go into the next stage. And then I can add more stages. These are all the stages that can be added. So the output of this last stage is the output of the entire pipeline. But then this data set actually has multiple pipelines. So if I click on change pipeline, you'll see there is also an additional pipeline, right?
Mm.
And what is that
Okay.
pipeline? This is join org. So this is actually the primary pipeline, the one which is coming below. And this is the additional pipeline. And I know that because I can see the name join
Mm.
org awk GDS, so which is join arc. And if I click here, this pipeline only has one stage, but then I can add more stages if I want,
Right.
right? So a
Got
pipeline
it.
is nothing but a number of stages. One or multiple pipelines form a data set, right? But a base data set can only have one pipeline. A derived data set can have multiple pipelines.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Now, when
Okay.
we actually create this data set, base data set, derived data set, then it will make much more sense, right? Once we know the theory,
Mm. Yeah.
and then when we actually create it in the system, then we'll be able to go back and relate it there. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at the data set stages. So a stage is a pipeline object, right? It is an object within a pipeline, and
Mhm.
it takes in data, transforms it in some way, and outputs the modified data. So that's what the pipeline stage does. The type of the stage determines what modification it will do. So whether it is a join
Mhm.
stage, an import stage, a, a part stage, a union stage. So the stage type would decide what modification it does, or a manage feed phase, and so on and so forth, right? But every stage is ultimately modifying some data. Okay, and outputs the modified data. Now, a stage only performs a single computational function. So each stage just does one modification. It could be a join, it could be a manage field, it could be a union. A single stage cannot do a join as well as an union, for example. So a single stage cannot import data as well as modify that data. So each stage just does one function, such as joining data or parsing data, etc.
So what do you mean by that? I didn't get that. So when you say single stage, you mean to say one stage will do joining data, one stage will do
Yes, right.
parsing. Is that what
Yes.
you're
So
saying? Oh, okay.
each stage
One
can
will
do
import
only one thing, right? So if I go to
one thing. Okay.
this stage is
Okay. One
importing data,
import.
and then this stage is joining data,
Okay.
and then
Yeah.
I can add a
Yeah.
stage to manage fields. I can do a validation. So every stage
Okay.
can only do one action. Okay. So
Okay.
each stage
Yeah.
can do only a single computational function. Again, you cannot join an union in the same stage. Not possible.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay. Now, if you delete a stage at any point in time, you can delete a stage. So if you see, I can come here and delete this stage, right? So I can delete all stages except for the import stage of the primary pipeline, because my data set itself has been created through a primary pipeline, right? So how was this data set created? When I created this primary pipeline, which is to import data into this data set, right? So if I delete the primary pipeline itself, my data set itself wouldn't exist, right?
Okay.
But With respect to a additional pipeline, if you see, I can delete all additional pipelines. So
Yeah.
you say you cannot delete a pipeline if it is used in the primary pipeline. Right now, this pipeline is used in the primary pipeline, and that's why I am not
Mm.
able to. But then you can
Okay.
delete all pipelines except for your primary pipeline, right? And we'll see how that is done. Okay, so deleting, okay, we'll talk about union stages and all the other stages. And so I'm sure you are aware of union and import and stuff, join.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so with respect to importing data, right? I've been talking about importing. With respect to importing,
Yeah.
there are two stages. One is import and the second one is parse. Okay, let me do one thing. I'll come here. Let's go back to our data catalog. Do I have the option to go to the data catalog? Yes, I do. So
Is it
I want to,
possible? Are we
hmm,
also going to create one? I'm sorry to
yeah,
ask.
that's what
Okay.
I'm doing, right?
Because actually I'm more of a system person,
Makes
so I
sense.
think I'll be able
That,
to.
that's what I'm trying
Yeah.
to do now. So here you have the
Okay,
create
great.
option, and within create, if you see, you can create a base data set, and there are three options for creating a base data set. We discussed this last time. So base data set can be created from
Right,
file,
right, right.
from SFTP, from custom report,
For yeah, from customer.
right? And a derived data set
Mm.
can only be created from other base data sets or other tables. There's other option called table as well. We'll talk about that later. So for now, let's say I want to create a base data set from some file. Okay. I'm clicking on from file. Okay, let's take, I don't think this file would work. I don't have any file in here. Okay, let me take this file for now. So the moment I do that, oh, if you see, Workday has automatically added the first stage for me. And the first stage is the parse stage,
Hmm. Okay.
right? So what is a parse stage versus what is an import stage, right? So in this data set which I'm creating now obviously this will not work because this is all dummy data. Let me down. I'm saying next. We'll talk about this and I'm saving this. So my data set name is put job profile, which Workday uses as the same one as the name of the file that I created. So if you remember, I mentioned the difference between a table and a data set is you have to first define a table, right? So when you go to any uh, any technology, for example, Java or SAP or Oracle, first tables are created and then
Hmm.
data is imported into those tables, right? And the data that is imported has to adhere to the semantics of that field or that column. So if a field is a number field, you cannot add text to it, or else your data doesn't behave properly. Now, unlike a table, a data set is automatically created based on the field types that exist. And Workday, if you see, automatically determines the field type. But then we can always go ahead and change this, right? Okay, now if I come on edit, here if you see, Workday has automatically added the parts stage, right? So what is a parts stage?
Okay.
Workday adds a parse stage when you import data from outside Workday.
Hmm.
Make sense?
Okay. Because
That means
so it has to. Okay.
So what is a parse stage? It actually has to parse the data which exists in your external file into Workday, right? So there you have to specify the
Yeah.
format, whether it is tab separated. If I come here and we'll talk about all of these options, just because this is a dummy file, I'm not. So here you specify with respect to parsing, whether it is a comma separated file, what is your escape character, quote character, so on and so forth. Whether you have to ignore the first row, right? So this is your parsing. And why is this required? Because you're importing data from a file from an SFTP system, and that external file's data
Mm.
has to be imported into a data set. So Workday should be able to read that data,
Mm.
right? Now, why is that Workday is not able to read this data? Because this is not a text file. This is not a CSV file. I don't have a file ready right now. So I just selected one of the random file, right? But then this is how Workday imports data. Makes sense? What is a part stage?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Then
So,
we'll talk about this stage in
okay.
detail. Yeah, go ahead.
So as soon as we import the file, we also add an option to parse. So in a
It's
format
not an option. When
or
you
okay.
import a file from external, the first stage is always parse,
Personal.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
So
good.
a parse
Okay.
stage is automatically added when you create a file or when you create a data set using external data, right? So a part stage is
Mm-hmm.
automatically added. And when do
Mm-hmm.
we read data using external data? File and SFTP. This is always base data set, right? You cannot read. So if you see here, if I go back now and let's go to data catalog. So I can only create a base data set from external data, from SFTP, from file. A derived data set, if I click on derived data set, a derived data set is always created using existing data sets. So here it is asking me which existing data set do I want to use to create my new derived data set. Make sense? So the first stage
Yeah.
of a base data set which is created using external data is always parse stage. Okay. So
Mm.
the first stage of a base data set which is created using external data which is from file or SFTP is always parse stage. You cannot delete or add a parse stage. Workday
Mm.
automatically adds it. So if you want in
Uh,
some data set you want to manually add a parse stage, it is not available. So parse stage
mm.
cannot be deleted or it cannot be modified, uh,
Mm.
manually added, right?
Okay.
So unlike a parse stage, an import stage is basically used when you import data into a base data set or a derived data set, right? So import stage and parse stage are basically doing the same thing. So import stage is the first stage in every pipeline of a derived data set. So the first stage of every pipeline of a derived data set is always import stage. Okay.
Okay.
So if I go to any derived data set, let's take this one. Or if I create a derived data set, let me do that. So if I come here, I create a derived data set, and let's say I take this as my data, or let's say this as my data set. So again, now why am I taking this? Because we already know a derived data set is always based on either a base data set or other data sets, right? A derived data set never gets data from outside Workday. So I'm taking, so for creating new
Mhm.
derived data set, I can select any of the existing data sets or table. So I'm selecting this random data set and I'm saying select. This is some name. So if you see, Workday has automatically given it some name, import of this. I'm calling it WB derived data set 1 test. Save. If I edit this now, if you see, Workday has now automatically added the primary pipeline, and the first stage of the primary pipeline is the import stage. Make sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So the moment I created this derived data set, Workday did two things. It first added a primary pipeline automatically, and the first stage of the primary pipeline, or basically any pipeline, is always the import. Any questions? Any confusions?
Um, yeah, one confusion. So I think you just showed me how the derived data set was created, right? You did not
Hmm.
create one, or
I
you did
created one, right,
created one.
Abhi? Yes, no. Were you not there? This is now I created, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay,
No,
no,
because
let
I
me
got
delete this and
connected.
create one. So, yeah.
No, I
So,
remember you're selecting something, but I don't know what where you went. Sorry.
where can I delete it? I think I can delete it in the data catalog. Mm,
Okay, you can delete from data catalog. Okay.
I'm also deleting the source, the base data set that I.
Okay,
Okay,
sorry.
so now I want to create a derived data set. I'll click here. I'm creating a derived data set. Now, as I mentioned, your derived data sets are
Yeah.
always based on either base data sets or other derived data sets or tables.
Or,
So you cannot create
mm,
a derived data
okay.
set using a file or using a custom report or using an SFTP.
Mm.
So those three data sets
Yeah,
are
yeah, yeah.
only, right? So here I'm selecting a
Okay.
random data set, right? So the new data set I want to create, I am basing it on this data set. Select,
Yeah. Yeah.
give it a name, and this is the name I gave it,
So,
WB DD test 1. I can add or create some tags. So when I create some tags, I can filter or search for those tags. So let me select this tag, right? It's already there, and save this.
okay.
So this is all I have to do for creating a derived data set. So my derived data set is
Mm.
created. When I click on edit, now if you see, Workday has done
Mm.
two things. It has already added the primary pipeline, and within that primary pipeline,
Yeah.
it has already added the import stage. So what is this import stage doing? It is importing data, which is the output of this data set, right? So
Okay.
this is what I mentioned, right? Every data set imports data
Yes, yes,
and then
yes.
it outputs data. The output of one data set can be the input of another data set, right? So that is
Yeah.
how I
Yeah, yeah.
already have these records. Make sense?
Okay. Yeah. Now, sorry about that.
No problem. So, what does an import stage do? It imports data from a source and for the derived data set, source is the output of a table or an existing data set, right? So again, a import stage imports data from a source, and as far as derived data sets goes, the source is always the output of another table or the output of an existing data set.
Okay.
Makes sense? Okay, so these are my basic stages, right? Or the first two stages. Then I
Okay.
have a few other stages as well. The first of which is a filter stage. Now, as the name suggests, a filter stage allows me to filter data, right? So the third
Mhm.
stage type is the filter. Okay, so for example, I can click here and uh, create a filter stage.
So it's like on the data which is imported, you're trying to filter.
Correct. So this is what I mentioned, right?
Okay.
Every
Right.
stage inputs data or imports data from the previous stage and then
Mm.
modifies it and then outputs data.
Okay.
So the output of
Yeah.
import stage go into the next stage. It does one modification and then it outputs data and then so on and so forth.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So a
Nice.
filter
It's
stage,
interesting.
sorry.
Okay. No, I said it's interesting, this whole concept.
Mm,
Yeah, good to know.
So a filter stage, basically what does a filter stage do? Changes the number of rows, right? Because if you're putting a filter, the input of a filter stage may be X rows, the output of the filter stage may be Y rows, right? Because you're applying a filter, right? So how does
Yeah.
a filter modify a data in the data set? It changes the number of rows at the output. It doesn't do anything else, right? You're just adding an
Yeah.
additional filter content.
Yeah.
Okay, now you can add filter anywhere. Of course, the first stage can only be an import or pass stage, but then your filter stage can be added in the middle or the end of a pipeline.
Okay.
So if I come here, click on an add stage, and let's see what filters do I want to put. Pension count. This is an integer. I want to say pension count is greater than 2000, let's say. So I am adding a stage which is filter, and I am adding a filter. Here I'm selecting the field and I'm saying pension count is greater than 2000,
Mhm.
right? And done, right? Now if you see, as I mentioned, this is the import stage. At this stage, I have
Yeah.
5 rows of that data
Yeah.
flows into this filter stage, and the output of
Okay.
this filter stage is 3 rows of data,
Yeah.
right? And these are those rows wherein the pension count is greater than 2000, right? So now it makes sense, right? A pipeline consists of a
Yeah.
number of
Yeah.
stages. Each stages is doing some
Right.
modification, and then pipeline
Correct.
outputs the data.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do
Okay.
you create a pipeline within that? Mm,
Okay. Again, we'll talk about that, but you can import
sure, sure,
additional
sure.
pipelines.
Okay, 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 okay.
Okay, so it is, just to answer your query for now, it is created using join or union, right? But then
हम्म,
let's first talk about join and union.
ठीक है.
So join is a very common criteria, I mean concept in, for example, SQL. Your entire SQL, if you have experience with that, it works on joins and unions and stuffs.
हम्म. Okay.
Okay, manage fields is where you can manage your fields, right? So now what do I mean by that? Uh, um, manage. So in fact, actually, Prism, that's why I keep saying it's very simple, because ultimately this is all the technology is. You understand these stages, you understand the calculations, and that's all it is. It's not a very complex thing to learn.
Okay.
So manage field states enable you to view uh, field changes, select and edit fields. So manage fields, as the name suggests, you can edit the fields. So for example, you can change the field type. So now, for example, I can add a manage field stage, just as an example. Here, I can change the field type, right? So the input type of this field is integer, and I can change
Hmm.
the output type to
To
something else.
text.
I can change it to
Okay.
numeric and so on and so forth, right? So that's all a manage field stages.
So can you add a new field here? No, right? You cannot.
No, you cannot. So manage fields, you cannot add a new field, right?
Okay.
But then we can always create calculated fields, Prism calculation fields, and we'll see that. So you can
Oh,
create any number of
okay.
extra fields through Prism
Okay.
calculations.
Okay.
So if you see, there's an option called add field. So that is separate out of your manage fields. What is manage field doing? It allows you to change the field type of existing fields. Your
Hmm.
add
Okay.
fields can be done anytime, right? So here it has added a new
Okay.
field for you.
So basically, when we import, the type is automatically deducted by
Yes,
Prism, but you have a flexibility to modify to whatever you want.
modified. Correct. So for example, when we
So,
imported, yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
So when we
Okay, so
imported
my
our
question is,
sorry.
sorry.
Okay. So yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
So
It's
what I was
fine.
saying is, for example, when I imported that file, right, some put job profile, it was an EIB field. Workday automatically determined the field type as text for those fields, right? So Workday does this matching and then automatically identifies, okay, this looks like a numeric, an integer, and so on and so forth, and automatically assigns
Mm.
the relevant field type. But then we always have the option to change it.
Yeah. So let's say, can we still make a change because there's already some data also, right? Are we still
Right?
allowed to make those changes?
Yes, because your data which
Oh.
is already there previously, your change is not
Mm.
impacting that data, right? So you import data, let's say you have some base data set, right?
Mm-hmm.
From which you imported data into derived data set, from which you imported
Yeah.
data into second data set. Now, this data you
Okay.
modify it here. Now, this does not impact data which already exists here, right? This data is here,
Yeah.
100 rows. It flows here. Here you have added filters and modifications and changed field types and so on and so forth. This is the data that exists now. Now this data would flow into this, wherein you may do more modifications.
Yeah.
Okay. So it doesn't impact anything which is already there. When you import new data, right, because your data keeps changing, right? When you import new data into base data set, it will then automatically flow into derived data set, wherein all those modifications would then again happen, and then it will again flow in here, right? So this is not static one time activity. In the sense you
Mm.
define those definitions once, but then Workday keeps using those definitions repeatedly.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Sure. Perfect. So let's stop here. Tomorrow
Yeah. Yeah.
we'll talk about stages. We'll also, so I'll need some work to do. I'll have to create some files and stuff so that we can test it tomorrow. Today when we created our data set, if you see base data set, there was actually no
Yeah.
data, right? So I'll have to create some
Yeah. Yeah.
files and stuff. So
Okay. Sure. Sure.
okay. And then we can actually check that a base data set end to end. We can see how it is created.